other. But Susan Davis, tell me now again, how are you trying to prevent, or how are you preventing collective amnesia?
Well, the main strategy is using the global women's movements. We've actually networked the national women's movements in practically every country of the world. People who wanted to participate in these UN conferences would come to New York because that's where the United Nations is. And when women would show up, because you know, it was their first time there, they needed a little help. So what we did, my organization, is we would facilitate the participation of everyone that wanted to work together in a common ground advocacy effort. And that's what the caucus is. And now the Women's Caucus has become an institution, and it's in every UN conference, and we're involved in the follow-up. So the activists in El Salvador, the activists in Tanzania, the activists in Norway, the activists in Germany, everyone decides that they want to work together and try and follow up on the promises that the governments make to us in all of these UN documents.
But how do you do this in practical terms? Do you go into the delegations from Norway, from Tanzania, and say to them that, well, you have been promising this and that, but you have broken the promises? Is that the way you work, or?
Well, there are many strategies, and each strategy has to be culturally appropriate. I don't know if me going in and lecturing your government on the promises they've broken would be terribly effective. But people find their own way. The strategy is to develop a strong advocacy strategy that's culturally appropriate, to share that collectively so that we know who is taking care of the Tanzanian government and who's going to chase the Indians, and maybe the Indians could use a little pressure from the UK. So we'll team up and plot together and figure out the strategy, and then we also create monitoring reports. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I came to Norway, is through Focus. We're having a conference, and I'm releasing a monitoring report on the follow-up 2 years after Beijing, 3 years after the Cairo conference, trying to find out just one simple question. Did governments honor the first time-bound commitment in the Platform for Action? That commitment was to make an action plan, to set the goals, to set the benchmarks for monitoring, to have the timetable, to have the resources allocated, and to do that before the end of 1996. You'd think it'd be simple, right? Well, the UN doesn't have this information because the governments don't give it to them. So what we had to do is organize our network from using the UN offices of UNIFEM or UNDP, as well as asking governments, as well as using the NGO activists and women's movements around the world. And we put together a list, and we've now found out from almost every country in the world, we're still waiting to hear from about 29, that 70% of the world's governments have indeed made their national action plan. Now, whether these plans are really significant and whether they'll translate into concrete improvements in the lives of women and girls, that remains to be seen. And that's the work of the on-the-ground campaigning that we're doing.
But Susan Davis, what kind of improvement are you asking for?
Well, the agenda is quite large, nothing short than changing everything, I suppose, in how we live, work, love, share the planet. You see, after Beijing, I think there were a couple of very important messages that changed the nature of the global women's movements in the 90s. It's not the old style 70s movement that's focusing on equality. In fact, people of my generation have understood that the women's movements really are leaders and change agents in all of the social change movements. We're needed as leaders in civil society to create a culture of accountability, by all public officials and institutions, because we're in crisis right now. People have very little trust in institutions, and we know that we also need a culture of empowerment, to release the human potential of men and women, to solve these desperate problems, So the messages that were coming out of Beijing were that there's no such thing anymore as women's issues. Now, you may be surprised to hear me say that, but I never talk about women's issues. In fact, all issues are women's issues. And women have both a right and a responsibility to speak out on all issues and to participate actively in the decision-making arenas that affect our lives. That's the economic arena, the business arena, the finance arena, the trade arena, the health arena, the education arena, every issue, media itself. We should be owning and controlling much more of the television and the radios, and I think the content would be different, and more programs like this would probably be on the air in countries like my own. The other thing I should fail to say is that all forms of discrimination are linked. You see, that's a very important message. We're not going to the UN or to all of these conferences and just saying, please end sexism against women, mainstream us into the existing system. That's an old message. In fact, the new understanding is that all forms of discrimination are linked, and we have both a right and responsibility to take on racism, the problems of class, of discrimination based on age, on ethnicity, on difference in religion, on sexuality and sexual orientation, because you can't fight one at a time. You can't fight one at a time. It's the old divide and conquer politics, you know. It's very convenient for people in power to have a scapegoat. Hitler did it with the Jews. In my own country, in the United States, we tend to pick on the most vulnerable, so gays and lesbians are very convenient because public opinion can easily, you know, be whipped up against, oh, gays.
Yeah, or
how
blacks.
About, new immigrants, huh? Blacks have always been the favorite whipping post, in fact, of the majorities of peoples of the world. I have often said that until the blackest, poorest, female, queerest person in the world is free, we're all not going to be safe or free.
So a part of your job then will be to monitor the scapegoats
Absolutely.
of the world.
Absolutely.
Not only in the United States, but all over the world, actually.
Right. Well, it's in the political interest of everyone, and that's why so many thousands. We now have more than 20,000 activists in our network. This network has been built up by the active signing up of a woman, or we've got quite a few men actually participating too, organizations over the years, only since 1990, when we started organizing for the Rio Earth Summit. So WEDO is a product of the 90s, and our vision is for the 21st century. And I think what we're advocating is for not even a different kind of development, it's for a different kind of evolution, one that's grounded in our principles, and one that will be good for everyone, men, women, children. Principles like justice, principles like fairness, principles such as sustainability. We have to look at whole systems. It's a new kind of paradigm where you're both self-reflective as well as looking at whole systems of life. You see, the economy, the global economy is only a subsystem of our larger ecosystem. And people who are starting to look for alternatives, and there are a growing number of us, maybe only 10% in the United States, and I don't know what it would be here in Norway, I hope more. But a growing number of us have looked at the world's crises, all of the indicators of ecological disaster and the downward spiral that this global economy is sending us into, the rising unemployment in the countries of affluence here in Europe. And we've said, what are we going to do about that? Are we just going to crash and hit the evolutionary wall? Or can we figure out ways to organize ourselves differently to respond to the ecological, economic, social, and spiritual crisis? And that's what the women's caucuses are about. That's what the civil society movements, that's what the accountability reports and the new campaigns are about. It's about people saying, let's try and have the empowerment values, the responsibility values, the equity values, the fairness values come into the way we're organizing our life. You see, these are old things. they're in the old wisdom. When you study wisdom from ancient civilizations, they're really not new ideas. But the way we live, our economy, is guided by the principles that we're living by. And that's the only thing we can really change.
Okay. We do for social change internationally.
Absolutely.
But then again, we are all driven by a world economy now that is called market economy, free enterprise. So, I mean, how can you ask for or hope for social change if we don't change that way of thinking? Or do you think we can use the economy to have a social change?
Well, a couple of points on that. I mean, the time that we're in right now is unique. We haven't been in the era of free market capitalism that's unbridled ever before. And it's a very short period of time when you look at the lifespan of human civilization. So I think it is possible to change. Many people look at it as if it were given, as if this is the way nature made us. But in fact, this is a man-made creation, particularly male-made, I might add. But the second point is, women are not anti-market in the network that I'm in. I, in fact, used to participate in export trade. I understand business. I've been in business, and I'm a great supporter of some parts of the private sector. The part of the private sector where women are tend to be the informal sector, the small business sector, the business sector that's grounded in communities that are providing the goods and services that we need to keep our communities healthy and functioning and providing the kinds of care. Now, that part of the private sector is not the subject of debate of globalization. In fact, what's really fueling the debate today on and the negative effects of globalization on our economy is because transnational corporations have really taken control of our global economy, and our political decision-making bodies are standing back and desperate. They don't know what to do. They have, in fact, lost power. The nation-state's power has declined and is subservient to the economic power of the transnational corporations. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a hysterical conspiracy theorist. It's not that these people in the corporations are evil. They are part of a dynamic now that has, in fact, gotten out of control. It's part of the technological change. We have, it's not even the trading arena that's as large. The global capital arena is trillions and trillions of dollars, and it moves 24 hours a day. And the instability that can be introduced through speculation is tremendous. Now, where do we put the brakes on that kind of system? A system that's driven by what values? Short-term return on profit, by greed. And the ability of our politicians, our elected officials, to regulate this activity is in question right now. And the answer is that people must tell their politicians to take back control over economic decision-making. We must not give up our power to decide what kind of communities we want to live in to central bankers. And in fact, that's what's happening. Look at the debate on the euro dollar and the European Monetary Union. In fact, it's not a slip. It will be the euro dollar because it will be pegged to the dollar. And I think the danger is that people don't understand what's in our economic self-interest. We're being deluged daily through advertising and messages through a press that's controlled by transnational corporations. We think we have a free press, but do we really?
Do we really? Well, that's the question. We can't answer it here and now. But what I would ask you then is that by doing the job that you are doing, you are actually saying that national governments are falling through.
That's right.
They are not doing the job they should do.
That's right. You see, first of all, it's a difficult job. You know, I don't think anybody who takes on a chair of sitting in a political office has an easy job. but our best people are not running for office. Certainly that's true in the United States. Because again, we have let money dictate too much of the terms of the game in the political arena. Special interest groups who actually do lobbying come in and are often paying for influence. That's not the kind of advocacy that our network is doing, you know. And what we're talking about is trying to introduce some means of accountability. You see, politicians who are elected really must serve the best interests of people, and we need to look at a longer time horizon. It's not just until the next election. We have to make decisions that will be good for this generation and future generations. One of the most valuable things that we could do in implementing the provisions in Beijing and other conferences is to change the numbers that we focus on for global growth. What do I mean? The gross national product, the gross domestic product, are not calculating the value of the carrying economy or of nature. It's an old debate, probably here in Norway, but it was a big decision for governments of the world to say, yeah, well, maybe we should count the value of unpaid work. It's true, women do most of that work. And the UN actually tried to make that kind of calculation, and they figured that there's probably $16 trillion of unpaid work in the economy, and probably 11 trillion of that is done by women around the world.
But Susan Davis, are you also saying that market economy is a threat to certain democratic values?
Oh, absolutely. The way market economy is currently constructed and being executed, we are ceding power to the interests of an elite. Look at the polarization of wealth around the world and within the affluent countries. In my own country, in the United States, it's just shocking. When we have somehow let business executives make 30, 40, 50 times the lowest paid worker. I mean, we have to ask ourselves, again, going back to values and principles, what do we really want out of life? Is it the search for material gain and acquisition that makes us truly happy? I don't think so. Look at the polls that are done. On 1991, there was a poll in 24 countries on values. In 93, there was a poll done in 24 countries on environmental awareness, and there was another done in 1995 on gender equality. If you look at those polls, you see that the majority of people in the rich countries and the poor countries actually understand that we need to protect the environment. And they all, even in the poor countries, would sacrifice some economic growth to protect the environment. All of them say they recognize the situation of women is worse than men. And all of them think that their countries would be better off if women were involved in the political system and were actually running things in equal numbers. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that ordinary people understand what's important in their life. On their deathbed, they don't say, oh, I wish I had gone shopping for 6 more hours and bought 1 more sweater. I wish I could have, 24-hour access to snow peas and exotic fruits. That's not what is driving people anywhere in the world, whether you're rich or poor. I mean, people want to have enough. But enough is not being defined by the kinds of Baskin and Robbins choices that this free market is giving us. We don't need 33 or 300 flavors of ice cream.
And in the heart of market economy in the United States, you are still using more on building jails than you are using on your educational system.
That's right. It reflects the sad state of power politics. In fact, it brings us back to one of my original points about discrimination. We build jails because we scapegoat black people, particularly black youth. The young black man is an endangered species in the United States. More of them die or get put in prison than survive. And the reason is we have a public clamoring for more police, more jails, because we're afraid. We have been brought up now in a culture of violence. It's everywhere, on our movies, on our television, in our politics, in our foreign policy. and in our economy. And the kind of violence we have in our culture also allows us to divide and conquer. As long as we have somebody to be afraid of, good, nice families want to protect their family from those kind of people. It's the other. And yet, what do those young boys really want out of life? It's not very different. But through a culture of drugs and lost opportunity and alienation, they're facing a prospect where, sure, this is the status quo. They're deep problems. There aren't easy answers. Don't get me wrong. I don't think any of these problems are going to be solved quickly overnight or through some glib answer. I think what it requires is persistence and tenacity and real movement building, you know, where people are involved. The people who are affected are involved in solving their own problems. And, you know, we're getting the governments we deserve. Most of us live in hypocrisies, not democracies. And that's why our role is to go into the United Nations and tell the truth.
Susan Davis, to sum it all up, it's not a, what should I say, brightest picture you are drawing for our future. But yesterday you said to me that strong forces that drive us in life, that are forces like ideas or love, you said.
That's right.
So what
That's
is your
right.
hope for the future now?
That's right. You see, other than violence, where is the power? Power in the world. And I believe that ideas are very powerful. And I do believe in the power of love. It's a very old idea and it's a very personal idea, and yet I think it's a very political idea, because it enables us to overcome our fears and our insecurities. And perhaps I can do nothing more than change myself. But if each of us, in our own path of personal evolution and growth, pursue these kinds of values that are most important to us, I think it does give a new way out, and maybe the picture won't be so dark in the next millennium.
I certainly hope so.
I do too. And I think that when people recognize that changing the basic gender relationships between men and women, we will go to the root causes of much of our culture of violence. And if we understand the way that gender subordination has helped to create and subsidize this free market economy, we'll understand why it's a key. It's the key catalytic change agent. Once you start changing your most intimate relations, you start seeing the ways that we can unfold and unlock and change our economic relations. And hopefully, I mean, my hope is that we'll have healthy lives and healthy communities, and we'll leave something for future generations.
So